Thank you, Ken. Appreciate it. He said we go back a long year. They're celebrating anniversaries, and I'm celebrating my 80th anniversary this year. So. As Ken said, I was raised in Salida. This whole basin is home. I learned to ski at Cooper Hill. We played basketball, same league with Leadville. I represented Amex, although not over here in Gunnison. So I feel this is home. I was raised 100 yards from the Arkansas River and about a mile from South Arkansas. And he said I caught a lot of fish with the rod and stuff. The fact is I caught more fish on Little River with my hands than I ever did with the hook. And little trivia, which is the hardest fish to catch with your hands? Sucker, brown trout, or rainbow? Sucker. You touch the suckers, they're gone. The big brown trout are easy. So there's a statute of limitations, so they can't come back on me. I also learned about environmental laws because the sewer ran without a sewer plant just behind our house directly into the river. And so my mother wouldn't let me keep the fish that we caught. So that's where you learn catch and release. I learned the use of scotch with water many years later. I was fortunate early, and many of us in law school at the time. Clyde March was a great professor. And I was also lucky I started practice with an experienced water lawyer, and he got me started into it. And one of the things I'm going to talk a little bit about education, but as everybody here, I'm sure, has observed, or most everybody, is that there's and there will continue to be a lack of knowledge in the public, not in the water community, but in the public. So I've learned early on that there was no information or lack of information. So I've been interested in that a long number of years. This talk is entitled "Politics of Water," and I gave a similar talk to the same organization in 1999. And I'd like to preparing for this, I decided to look a little deeper and a little broader, so I changed it. But for the purpose of this talk, what I define politics, the art or practice of influencing water decisions, either directly or by influencing the appointment of those who manage or control. In other words, how to influence water a decision. And I would note, many of you here I know have been involved in the same things that I have. It's an art more than a science. And the better ones that influence are the true artists. I've expanded the talk this year to cover some changes the past 50, 60 years, one of which is the introduction of environmental laws that didn't exist years ago when I first started practice. Environmental laws are used many times. People in the environmental community trying to stop projects use laws, and that's fair game. How important it is to educate people. I'll broaden that. And it's way more complex than it used to be when I started practice. And then I'd like to end with, it's a new era of cooperation in water. Address some of the things that have been addressed earlier. If you use it as a tool, there's unlimited ways in which it can be used, and there's no precise way to do it. But it's important to have an informed public. It's important to have informed political leaders, community leaders, and so that's one of the tools that can help you get. And some basic principles of advocacy. I remember an old law professor years ago said in advocacy there are two separate distinct parts. He said most lawyers think it's just simple, the law and the facts. He said much more important is you got to make them first want to decide for you. They'll take the facts and the law to work out a way to come out to your conclusion. This doesn't do away with the need to be thorough and prepared and all, but it gets you over the finish line. I've observed over the years in my law practice and other matters that if you start getting inside the mind of people to make them want to decide, it's a lot easier. And another one, Ken and I had a teacher in high school, spoke 7 languages, Russian very well, and I can still hear him saying with this deep voice, change begins in the minds of men. You've got to get into, if you're going to influence whoever it is, that's the decision in your particular water matter, you have to finally get into there, and it's not a science. Each one is different. I've just listed a number of entities involved in water decisions, and it's not there's an unlimited number of. You've all been involved again in those. You're obviously, depending on which organization you're with, or where there's Congress, the Bureau of Reclamation. We have a lot to do in our basin. I know you do here with the Bureau of Reclamation, Corps of Engineers, EPA, the state level, Water Conservation Board, the state engineer, Department of Natural Resources, Water and Power Authority, Attorney General. Then you have the water conservation districts, Southeast District, Colorado District, Upper Arkansas, etc. You have unlimited dealings, and ability to deal with them, political, is very important to get success down to your county commissioners, your city councils, and water user entities. Some of the tools that are available, as I mentioned earlier, it's an art, not a science. But I'd like to mention, and although there's not the direct contact alcohol tool, but one of the basics is money. And if you don't have the money to build your project, you're dead. If you don't have the money to hire the consultants or your lawyers or your lobbyists, whatever it is, you'll fail. So one of the first things that you have to do is make sure you have the resources. Lee mentioned the fact that they went out and selling frying pans to get going on the fry arc. There's numerous examples of that. One of the reasons the Upper Arkansas was created in the first place was to give them a base to raise money so they could represent themselves. Obviously, it's engineering and science, assuming it's a project that involves engineering and science, to get the best you can. Same thing is, don't try to get something done if it's going to violate the law, because you can't get there. So you have to, and one of the most important things in politics of water is commitment. You know a lot of examples, virtually every project that you can think of, there was a commitment of a person or a number of persons that banded together to make it successful. John Fetcher, I don't know how many of you knew John. He worked for years getting a project up around Steamboat Springs. Every time he moved, he was there. He talked to the politicians and everybody else, the townspeople getting support, and stayed with it. I understand the Big Thompson project was the same thing. I knew Bill Farr that was involved in that, and he told the stories about they got the community support. Sam Maines and Leonard Birch. Sam Maines is a longtime attorney for the Southwest District. They're fighting for the Animals of Plata. He and Leonard Birch were the tribal chairman. There are legendary stories of them going around the state, going back to meet with Congress to get it. It got watered down before it finally got it, but they were able to get it after Sam's death. There's unlimited stories of that. Obviously, you need to start with an understanding of what you're about. First of all, you better define fairly precisely what goal you want, what you want to accomplish, so you don't get diverted and others don't understand it. And you better understand, more than anything, is your opposition. We're assuming in these situations we're talking about, it's not an easy project, it's going to be somebody on the other side. Understand where they're coming from, their strengths, their weaknesses, etc. And learn as much as you can about the ultimate decision maker, whether it's a judge or a board of county commissioners or Congress. Find out how they make their decisions, who influences them, how the other thing, anything about how your specific question fits in the big picture. It may be that it sounds good in the small, but if you look at the bigger picture, it isn't going to work. So, and then find the scope or limits of the entity in the process involved. Can they handle your situation? And then, bottom line, make it understandable. If the people don't understand what you're doing, and many times people get so involved in something and they think the whole world understands what they do, and they don't. Make it simple. Then you need to develop your plan or your strategy. And it's an overall plan, and also what forces are out there that you might join to be partnership with you to help you push it. And then last, make it realistic. We all get our passion at times, but you need to step back and look, say, is it possible? Is it realistic to get it done? In terms of the tools available, you start at the top. You got Congress and utilizing U.S. senators, their staff. I know many of you in this room know the staff of the congressional delegation of Colorado. You know who to go, that you can get help from, who you can't get help from. It depends on what it is. Most of us are not involved at that level, but mostly it's a thing at your local county or your local city or things like that. But those are important. Another one, in getting a lobbyist. I remember 13 years ago I mentioned what I'm going to mention now. Is about get somebody like Ray Kagosic, who's familiar with the system. I got a call 2 days later, and he thanked me for helping him market his business. But the same does apply. Every institution has their unique interests, biases, etc. So get somebody that knows what they're doing. And there are others other than Ray Kagosic, but he was both in the legislature in Colorado and also then in Congress. And somebody like that is invaluable if you're going to get it done. There are organizations. National Water Resources Association. They work closely with the Colorado Water Congress. You can get help there. Same thing with Department of Interior, Department of Agriculture. Those people you deal with. In Colorado, I'd say probably the most influential organization, especially in killing legislation, and very strong in passing, is the Colorado Water Congress. They've been around over 50 years, and they've really created, and they broadened their scope. They used to be pretty narrow to agriculture, municipal water, that type of thing, but they're much bigger umbrella now. They cover a greater interest of people. And by the way the organization is set up and operate, they really screen things out. So by the time they get done, they're prepared and can be very effective. There are others, of course, Club 20 that we have in Western Colorado has been very helpful for Western Colorado, as is Action 22, Colorado Association of Commerce and Industry, Colorado Cattlemen's and Farm Bureau, all. They have the sophisticated lobbyists know what they're doing. The process and how it works, people frequently think they're going to change the law. That's not likely. Water rights are a property right protected by both the federal and state constitutions, and the idea is of changing that takes away somebody's existing water right isn't going to happen. So figure out if it's one of those rights that you're going to upset in the process. And then the process, there's a number of ways to do it. You can get your direct contact with the decision maker. You work with other entities. Sometimes even create a new special interest organization for the specific project if you need to do it for raising funds, as Upper Arkansas did when they created their district. You're paid lots. The court system, I like to mention, for you purists out there that think the court system is immune from political lobbying, it's not. In the traditional sense of going to the judge and tell you don't do that, that's not allowed. But if you have a very controversial case, I'll guarantee you, if you have organizations out there that are supporting it, and there's a high percentage that the public supports it, that's the old make them want to decide for you, unless the law is pretty clear. If in a close call, you'll win the close call. If it's not a close call, you're not going to win it. But there's also instances of selecting the right forum, picking the right court. In some cases, you have a federal forum, you can go take your case out of the state. The other time, even with your own judicial district, you have a chance to pick the judge the case you want to do. So that all becomes important. A ballot initiative is one way to go, and they're a tough way to go. And there's one that's up right now, as you're probably familiar, to pass a public trust law. And the problem with that is once approved, it's very difficult to get it undone. It's black and white. It's win or lose. So it's difficult. It's also, the process is difficult to get it, but there are times when it's appropriate. And when I gave the talk previously, I didn't check recently. It's attempted frequently, but not that many ago. 86 initiatives filed between May of '98 and March of '99. Now, I'd like to go into some examples of things that have been used in the past. Some I was involved in, others I'm aware of. how politics were used for projects. The one was mentioned, the Frying Pan, Arkansas. Steve Sims, who was in the Attorney General's office. We were involved in the Union Park litigation. We went and interviewed, this is one of the greatest interviews I ever had, was Felix Sparks. We met with him for about 4 hours. We started to see if he was going to be a witness in the case. What he was going to say wasn't going to help us, so we walked away from that fairly quickly. But we got a couple of the stories from him that were interesting. One was, which doesn't relate to this, but when he was a district attorney in Delta, how he got a cattle thief who had stole the cows, but he just took them back to the cows and they paired up, and so they solved the case, and how he got a young guy to alert him to do that. Another one was he was the commanding officer that liberated Dachau. And he told the story about they got there, and a young lieutenant with the sight and smell of death started shooting the Germans, and he literally had to knock him out with the butt of a pistol to stop him. He was a young guy. New York Times, the lady wrote a story saying he ought to be court-martialed. And so he met with Patton to see about the court-martial, and apparently Patton said, you know, Colonel, it's good to see you again. Haven't seen you since North Africa. How you doing? They chatted. He took the court-martial papers, tore them up, put them away. So I said, Colonel, does that take care of your problem? Good to see you again. But the last one, he was head of the Water Conservation Board when they were pushing the Frying Pan, Arkansas project. Wayne Aspinall, a Western Colorado congressman, as most of the Western Colorado opposed Trans Mountain diversion. Frying Pan, Arkansas was a Trans Mountain diversion, but he said, I also represent the state of Colorado. And he told Felix, if you can show me that you've got the support in Congress, I'll release him to the committee. Wayne was chairman of the Insular and Interior Affairs Committee, and he said, I'll release him to the committee. So they did, as Lee mentioned, they went out and raised money in the Arkansas Valley, Colorado Springs, and Denver till they had the money. They then went back to Washington, D.C., and leased, I think it was 1 or 2 floors in a hotel. And they would meet every morning, just like when he was the commanding officer, and they'd organize their strategy and what they were going to do. And they would, for example, get an Italian to go talk to an Italian congressman, get a woman to go talk to a woman congressman. He said they had money for food and golf and even women. And he was dead serious on that. But they then got the votes, and Wayne Aspinall, orally. So Wayne Aspinall then released from the committee, and that gives an example of the politics, example of the passion to get it done. The animus of Plata I mentioned previously. A number of people from southwest Colorado, but in particular Sam Maines and Leonard Birch, they worked hard. They spent many hours in Washington. Another one, and one of the things I mentioned in terms of what is politics, it's influencing the decision makers and people that are relevant. Mike Strang ran for Congress in 3rd Congressional District. His opponent was a man from Crested Butte, Mayor Mitchell. And he and I didn't agree on many things when it came to politics. Otherwise, I liked the guy. But I decided early on that we needed a different congressman to be elected. You may remember that he made his mark. He was a paraplegic, and he had 2 accidents. One was an airplane, and it broke his back, being paraplegic. And then he was in, I think it was a motorcycle ride, and got burned all over his face. He had a great voice. And he would set himself outside of meetings. He'd walk 5 minutes before the meeting out there so everybody would see him. He had articles in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, etc., and fighting the Amex mine at Crested Butte. I represented Amex, and it went beyond that. So I went to Mike Strang's committee, his campaign chairman, and said, I'll put together a water program, because I know Mitchell is not very knowledgeable in water. And he apparently said that, I heard it secondhand, that his campaign manager said, oh, water's not that big an issue in 3rd Congressional District, which he was wrong. But anyway, when I got to Mike, said, I don't know who Dick Bratton is, but we accept. So we put a campaign on, and we had he was 10 points behind in the polls before we started this. And we had one day we picked, we were going to go to 4 towns in an airplane with the press all there. we had the same ad come out in every paper in the district, but with different names. The local endorsement, we had two, Mike and another one were in all of them. The other two, we had two local people in every one. Things like Mike, as a rancher, learned water at the low end of the ditch and high end of the shovel, and pointing out that Mitchell, a week after we did that, Mike was ahead by 10 points, and they never moved back. And it's my understanding that Mitchell said at one point in San Luis Valley, he started talking about water, and he says, well, as you all probably know by now, I don't know much about it. We plant people in where he was going to ask him questions. The other, when Governor Ritter ran against Bob Beaupre, and I was involved in that, not on the winner's side, I honestly think that one of the changing points in Bill Ritter getting elected, I talked to Harris Sherman later, and they really woodshedded him. They were afraid he was going to be vulnerable, and I think that the water issue had a lot to do with Bill Ritter being elected. Ken Salazar, I'm a hardcore Republican, but because Ken had done so much in water, a number of us, including my old partner John Hill, walked the 16th Street Mall in behavior of Ken because we felt that that was important. So Ken put together great support to get him elected. Many times appointments come up that people that you want, and one of the ones that is probably the most important is the Water Conservation Board. That's an important board, and it's important to get quality people on there. We've had a local rule in our district in Gunnison, Montrose area that we rotate between Delta, Gunnison, and Montrose. I don't know if there's anybody from Uray or not. We inform it so we don't get a political battle particularly, but there's lobbying goes on, put the credentials to get somebody in that's knowledgeable. It's extremely important, and I've been involved in that, and I know a lot of people in here in the office have been too. I mentioned the Colorado Water Congress. And when you're involved in the state legislature in Colorado, your best bet in general, if it's something the Water Congress is familiar with, use them. They really take. Another one that on a local basis, your conservancy districts. Those appointments are important. And I think most districts around the state, they do the same thing. They get together and discuss who they like to get in, their competing interests, and they do their lobbying. But that's also extremely important. 1999, there was a dissatisfaction in Gunnison because it's always been court appointed. There's also a procedure you can request an election, and they did have an election in Gunnison. In litigation, when I was involved in the Taylor Park Reservoir refill right. 1975, we reached an agreement that the reservoir, which really was owned by the United States but operated by Uncompahgre, who had to pay for it, we reached an agreement that Uncompahgre could get their water out of Blue Mesa, and the Upper Basin could use Taylor Park Reservoir. And we filed for it. And what we did, we stored the water. The concept was to store the water in Blue Mesa, release it downstream between Taylor and store the water in Taylor Dam and release it down there to Blue Mesa. And the use, in addition to agriculture and some flood control, was to increase the brown trout fishery, similar to what's happened on the Arkansas, and a stable base for floating. Arapahoe County was opposed to it because we were asking for a second fill, which essentially took all the water in the basin. So there was none left for them, and we had the priority date because we started earlier. So it was very important that we won that litigation. There was a concern that the state's in-stream flow law only allowed the state to do that. The difference legally was that we first stored the water in Taylor Reservoir and released it. That's different than the Colorado in-stream flow law, which you don't have to store it. You don't have to control it. We satisfied the legal one, but it's still very politically sensitive. So I went again to Steve Sims, I just mentioned, and asked him if he could get the Water Conservation Board to support it. He said, I'm not a policymaker, but I agree with you. I think the law is okay. If you get a meeting, I will I will support your position. So I called Bob Jackson, who'd been on the Water and Power Authority with me. He was then chairman of the Water Conservation Board, and asked if we could meet. This is just a week before the meeting. So he authorized the meeting, and it went as we proposed. And I'd heard later that although it wasn't absolutely necessary, that it really helped the Supreme Court to see that the agency, possible competing law, didn't feel that they were affected by it. Did a similar thing in the Union Park litigation, and that one, the question in the Union Park litigation is whether Section 620F of the Colorado Storage Project Act, whether the United States could call their water rights. And if you read the law, you don't know what it means. The judge ruled on it 4 times, 2 times for us, 2 times against. I've never been in litigation where that happened. It was so complex and confusing. And there's a statutory interpretation rule that in those situations where they're ambiguous, you look at the person charged with the administration of the law and what's their position. In this case, it was the United States. My old partner, John Hill, at that time was the attorney for Department of Justice and would make that decision. So we did a lot of historical research to find out what was intended by that. Provided John a memo, and he agreed with it, and the United States then supported in the litigation. One that I was not sure I'd bring it up, so controversial, but the right to float issue, and John and I have been involved in that for some time. And without getting into the merits of that, there are about 3 phases of that in terms of political involvement. The first one, the Department of Natural Resources tried to get a committee together to work out a solution. The problem that it wouldn't work out was there was no agreement on what the law was. And until you agree what the law is, you don't want to give up your rights, so we never reached an agreement. Then there finally was litigation on the Lake Fork, and in terms of the political approach, the rafting community had a raft in. 100 people, they got national publicity about it. And then the third one was 2 years ago in the litigation legislation, the Kathleen Curry's bill, and that was one that both sides were really scrambling to meet with committees, individual legislators, etc. And it was finally taken care of when the governor interceded and pushed very hard for a settlement, and they did. They reached a 4-party agreement, got it worked out. I'm going to skip here. I want to say in brief, the Upper Arkansas has accomplished an awful lot. They're very far-sighted and creative. Starting in 1977, their concern was state engineer would not shut down the wells that were taking water out of the Arkansas. Ultimately ended up, as you know, in the Arkansas or the Kansas-Colorado case. But the concept of deciding that was a very sad event. George Everett, who was a leader in the community, the ranching community, you may recall that they were on the way to a meeting. Just before they got on the plane, George told Ken, he said, Ken, we need to form a water conservancy district for political support and raise financial support on that. It took them a few years to get going to do it, but they've been a real leader in it. They purchased Twin Lake shares. They've acquired several reservoirs in the area. And notwithstanding that, they've also provided water for, assisted for Slide of Poncha Springs and Buena Vista. But if you read the overall, and Ken wrote a history of that, I hadn't seen it till this weekend, read a history of that, and it's filled with ways that they utilize the political system to accomplish their goals. They went to Ray Kagosic to get assistance with the Forest Service permit. They knew that one judge wasn't, he wanted to have voting on that. They didn't, so then they worked. One of the things in getting support for something, you need to get the business industry, your community leaders, etc. They did that across the board in various places. They also worked directly with the state engineer, division engineer, water conservation, the Southeast District, and Department of Natural Resources. In terms of changes of past, I want to skip, because I think there may be some questions. I'll skip. A lot of environmental laws have really upset the apple cart and makes it more difficult and time-consuming. And I've listed in here a number of the entities you have to deal with. Second, educating the public has become very important. In 1975, Dwayne Vandenbush, a professor at Western State College, and I decided to create the water workshop, and the whole goal was to educate people about water. It wasn't a specific; it was a general education. It's necessary. So I happened to be at the time the president of the water conference at the time, and started them in some water conferences, which they do a lot more. But what it finally led up to was long process of a lot of people getting involved. They finally decided to create the Foundation for Water Education in Colorado. It was patterned somewhat off of the Water Education Foundation in California, and they just celebrated their 10th anniversary. And the way they finally became successful, we could never raise the money, but the way they became successful was when Lou Entz and what's the lady's name? Diane Hoppy, thank you. Got a bill passed the legislature to funding, and they're doing a lot of things that are very helpful. And if you have an informed public, we're all better off. The other, I want to mention that the new era of cooperation, and it's not just this last year, but John McLeod laid a great foundation when he talked about what happened in the 207 agreement. On that, I was chairman of the Upper Colorado River Commission, and watching me, it was very interesting because you've all read the stories, and it's all true. Most of the thing was confrontational between the lower basin and the upper basin, and particularly Arizona, very difficult. But as a matter of fact, we went to the Commissioner of Reclamation. It was in a drought. And we demanded, yeah, you demanded the secretary, but we demanded, it wasn't very successful, and said that you can't keep releasing 8.23 million acre feet. The water's not there. And the lower basin state said, but we're legally entitled to it. Her answer was great. She said, I do have the right to make the decision, but I won't make it now. You work it out. So with that backdrop, everybody was highly motivated for fear of what the outcome was going to be, both sides. And there was a cooperative error, but Arizona would end most meetings around 5 o'clock and threatening litigation, and California would woodshed them overnight. They go to dinner, come back the next morning, we were on track, and go again. But it was interesting to see the process, how that worked. That there are a variety of things that happened there, and I think, and I saw, can't think of her name, the head of the Nevada Water Authority. She said it's a process, not an event. Critical for our parties work together. And it was important in this one also to note one state could upset the apple cart, so you need all 7 to participate. You couldn't, and there was a lot of tension. I think the tension maybe kept them together as much as it kept them apart. Beer Reclamation, their engineers, a guy named Terry Fulp was the master. He really guided him through this plan that John described. But in the process, they also are working on a Colorado River Basin study supposed to be completed this year, try to get solutions to it, including importation of water. Still, the major fund is how to finance augmentation progress, things like that. And the Arkansas River, as you people, many of you here know a lot more about than I do, but I know you had a similar situation on the Arkansas. Just a little trivia, 1949 in June was the first Arkansas River boat race. The KVRH and Slida broadcasted, and they went all the way to Canyon City. Only 2 boaters, 2 guys from Sweden, the only ones that made it there, but it was proposed. So they had people staked out with walkie-talkies to announce, and my dad and I were down at the Coaldale area on it. So starting at that time, and the growth of that industry, which has been fantastic, and the rafting on the Arkansas, that then developed conflicts with fishermen and the agriculture. But the group, the Arkansas Headwaters, really need to be complimented. They did some of the same things we did in Gunnison in coordinating the release of the flows, trying to have a minimum flow for fisheries on there. No water rights can be impacted. The Bureau of Reclamation was involved. The Water Conservation Board was involved. The Southeast District was involved, but that was great. Then I'll skip up. The Denver Water Board and the Colorado River District have also made great progress. And if you start with the Foothills Treatment Plant in '74, very controversial. Finally, it was mediated by Congressman Worth. Then followed the Two Forks Project. They created the Metropolitan Water Roundtable to build consensus, and that started to get the cooperation. and although it was ultimately failed for environmental reasons. Then the Whitford Mountain Reservoir, they reached an agreement. The River District needed money to build the reservoir, and Denver needed water, and so they got a permanent 40% interest for the financial contribution. Then you got the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement, which is going now, 34 parties to that. Negotiations started in 2007. Very comprehensive, very specific. But it was felt by the people that I've talked to, been involved in it, although it's time-consuming, they think the benefits of collaboration and face-to-face discussion, just like on the Colorado River, brought it. And then last, and this was from the top down, most of them come from the bottom up, House Bill 1177, creation by Russ George. Although I haven't been involved in that process, I know that there's great hope that that's going to provide some answers. I've attached to this, and I want to thank Chris Treese and Martha Moore at the River District providing. I think you'll find it interesting reading. I've attached for you the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement report on that, Interbasin Compact Committee, and a report by that committee, and then the draft of Colorado Water for 21st Century. I think that's John's the most recent one, I think, on that. Take the time to read those. I did. They're very informative. I won't try to cover what they have on there, but all of it involves politics in the sense, how do you get things done?